Hey folks, how are we doing? Hi David.
Hey Greg, hello. How you doing?
Good. Hey, thanks all for joining us today for this session. I know for the Indian friends, that's as early in the morning in their working day, and for the Asia Pacific people, it's part of the afternoon. So for those that don't know me, I'm Greg. I'm I suppose long-term Microsoft MVP and part of the Microsoft Regional Director Program. That just gets me in a whole lot of interesting mailing lists inside Microsoft. And work for a company called SQL Down Under. I founded in Melbourne in Australia, and contact details are there. So, and David.
And I'm a Microsoft MVP for Data Platform, independent data architect and consultant at Actionable Data Analytics, as well in Australia, but in this case in Brisbane, which is such a beautiful place right now. To give you a hint as well, when I was starting in my career, I used to read Greg Lowe's blog posts.
There you go. All good. And listen, we're not on our own today. We've got the wonderful Chris Hyde as our moderator. And so Chris from Hydrate Consulting. And so look, in the chat, you get to say hi to Chris. I encourage you to do that. And David, if we want to follow along, what do we do?
So if you want to follow along today with the content as well with the exercise, we do suggest to go and scan the QR code or just type the link to follow the module to work with Delta Lake tables in Microsoft Fabric today. Greg, can people participate in this session today?
Yeah, lots of different ways. So as well as following along with those exercises, and there are videos and things online and practicing, which you can get to with the QR code. But as well as that, we've got, of course, the chat. And so one of the real advantages of you attending in this live session is the fact that you get to interact with real humans rather than just a recording. And so I know some of you will watch the recording later, and that's great. But if you are one of the people who are attending live, we'd just love you to be interactive. Now, David and I won't be able to monitor the chat the whole time as we're going, but of course that's where our wonderful friend Chris will come in, and I'm sure he will answer a number of questions himself, or if he thinks it's of general interest to a lot more people, he'll try and find a good spot to pop in and ask us the question as well. So that should then get it pretty interactive as we go along. Now, one of the things that I've been quite keen on is that Microsoft's had a series of these cloud skills challenges. They've appeared at different events over recent times. And there was a Fabric Cloud Skills Challenge that was associated with Microsoft Ignite last year. And so if you did that Cloud Skills Challenge at Ignite, you will know there are a whole bunch of modules that you went through. But there's now a further Cloud Skills Challenge, and this is one that has the potential for a 50% exam discount attached to it. And this one has additional modules. So if you did the Cloud Skills Challenge at Ignite, I'd encourage you to pop back to that link that's at the top here with part of what's called Fabric 30 Days to Learn It. And so Fabric 30 DLTI. So look, pop and have a look at that. You'll find there's additional modules over the top of the ones that you may have done before. And as well, of course, we have DP600 as the exam. And so that's been released in beta just recently. And I'd encourage you, look, try and have a go at this exam. The product group really wants to get as many people as possible certified during this year. And this is a great way to get started with this. And so noted there when that's appearing. And so there'll be a series of these exam crams to help you sort of prepare for that DP600 exam. It is a wide-ranging exam, so don't take this trivially. I mean, there are a lot of things you need to learn to work with the DP600 exam, but the materials that are being presented in these sessions and the exam crams and things that are being organized as well can help you a great deal to get along and do that. But if you then start to want to build your career based on Fabric, what happens, David?
So you have the new Microsoft Career Hub. So you will find information about the exam that you just mentioned, Greg. You have opportunity to join live sessions like this one. you'll have access to a practice test exam near in the future. And additionally, I think it's really important, you will hear stories from data professionals that they have taken their careers to a different level by using Microsoft tools.
Yeah.
And on top of that, so if you really want to take your skills with Fabric to the next level, next March, we have the Microsoft Fabric Community Conference in Las Vegas. And by joining this session, you can use the coupon code that you have now in the screen to get a $100 discount. So if you're into community, if you're into Fabric, I highly recommend to go and have a look at the Fabric Career Hub, as well as the Microsoft Fabric Community Conference in Las Vegas in March. Greg,
I think if I could be anywhere in March, I wish I could be there at that one. That looks like it'll be a whole lot of fun.
It'll be a lot of fun. So I think there are community speakers, Microsoft MVP, there are Microsoft employees, there are some of the most respected Microsoft professionals. They'll be there at Microsoft Fabric Community Conference in March. But I think
there's a link there for the discount as well. So
yeah, I think that's handy, right? Who doesn't like discount?
Yes, indeed. And listen, this session that we're doing here too, this is not the only one in this series. Clearly, this is number 3 in the series. So there's a whole set of these. So the first one gives you an end-to-end picture of how things work. The second one's interesting because it covers quite a bit of Spark. And so if you haven't seen that so far, then I'd suggest you go back and have a look at that. Some of the early feedback I heard from people taking the new exam is that they were a bit underprepared in terms of Spark and Python and those sort of areas. So if you're coming from a traditional SQL background or things like that inside Microsoft, you might want to make sure that you've got in and had a really good look at that. And then you can see there's pipelines, then data flows. Of course, it's been rebuilt entirely, basically, in Fabric for this version. And then data warehouses, which is still the SQL experience for working with Fabric, and medallion architectures around the bronze, silver, gold that we work with in lakehouses and so on. And again, more about bringing data in with Spark and Fabric, and finally administering it. So there's a lot of good stuff coming. But what about the objectives for this session?
Yeah, so for today, we have 4 main things I want to cover. The first one is to understand Delta Lake and Delta tables with Microsoft Fabric. The second one will be to create and manage Delta tables using Spark in Fabric, use Spark to query and transform data with Delta tables, and finally, use Delta tables with Spark, structured streaming. But what if we just get started, Greg? What can you tell me about Delta Lake?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that surprises people is the structure of how data is now going to be stored in Fabric. And so one of the things that they did, if you look at traditional database systems and things, they all had their own proprietary data formats for how data was stored. The decision was made to go to a very much more open architecture here. And so a Delta Lake is an open source storage layer in this case. And what we have are files that live in equivalent of Azure Data Lake storage and so on, equivalent of that. But what then happens is that we've got relational semantics layered over this. So we've got the ability to then query it using SQL language and so on. Now, the files themselves, I see a lot of people confused because they talk about Delta Parquet, and people go, is that Parquet? Is Delta a format? And so on. And so it's not quite like that. So if you look at Parquet files, they were defined as part of the Apache project, and that's an open source thing. You can look at that. In fact, there are straightforward documents you can bring down that give you details of the Parquet format and so on. So you can look and see exactly how that works internally. And one of the key things they did with the Parquet format is they went for column-based storage and went with column-based compression. And so if you look at traditional database files, or if you look at particularly CSVs and JSON and files, those sort of formats, then what you usually have is rows of data stored as entire rows, and then a certain number of rows fit either on a page or in a file and so on from there. Now, it's one of the things that I thought was the best thing that came to SQL Server back in 2008 was table compression. And the page compression in that was the early beginnings of a lot of the column-based compression. And the trick with this is if you look at most of your typical data, particularly in analytic form, then if you look down a column, you'll realize there's a lot of commonality in the data that appears in columns. If you look across a row, it's very, very tough to get much compression happening across a row, but it's much, much easier to compress down a column because you'll get the same values appearing again and again and again in so many columns. In addition, the compression itself is good because it reduces the amount of data we need to move around, and you always want to minimize the amount of data that you're moving. And it also reduces the amount of memory that's needed to hold the data because it's in that sort of compressed format. And so if you look at what they did with a Parquet file, it's essentially storing the columns separately. So note in the example on the right-hand side here, we've got first name, it's got Abigail, Amanda, Melissa, and so on, and last name, and is premium customer. So they're storing the columns separately. Now, the first thing about that is that it allows you, when you run a query, to only bring back the columns that you need. So if I run a query that says, give me all the last names for someone who's a premium customer, I only need to read 2 of those chunks of data. I don't have to read the whole row in each case and sort of bring back and then decide what it is I need out of that. So I'm usually reading far less data. And the other thing we can do is that we can deal with repetitive data. So if you look at things like is premium customer, they've shown an example there where they've gone, the first value is 1, the next one's 0, then it's 1, then it's 0, then it's 1 for 2 rows. Then it's 0 for 2 rows. But of course, that might be for 5,000 rows, and so on. So you get the ability in many columns to drastically cut down the size of the data that's stored for the individual columns. In addition to this, what they've done is they've stored the metadata in the file as well. So if we look down the bottom, they've got column 1 is a string, column 2 is a string, column 3 is a Boolean, and so on. So they've actually stored details about the columns and their data types and so on as part of the file. Now, that column 1 is just a generic thing there. I mean, it does also obviously store the names of the columns and so on as part of that too. And so this is kind of a neat, tight format that's been able to be used, and it's great, and it's been around for quite a while. But what a Delta Parquet format is to take that even further. So if we start with a Parquet file, it's okay, but there's a whole lot of things that it doesn't do that we want to have if we want to try and treat this like a database. So if we want to deal with deletes and updates and merges, and if we really want to deal with things like ACID transactions, where we've got atomicity, consistency, isolation, durability, those sort of things, then we need something much, much more than just storing the current version of the data. So whenever you see something where people talk about Delta Parquet, the thing that's happening there is it's a case that this isn't a file. People talk about a Delta Parquet file. That's not appropriate. What it is, it's actually a folder. And so whenever you have this format, what you've got stored is a folder of files and potentially subfolders. So the first thing is that you've got the Parquet files that make up the data. It could be 1 or more of those, potentially 0 or more of those, but they need to be in there. We can also partition those. And so if we have, for example, we might partition by year. And so the idea is that way we can reduce which files we need to read, because if we know that it's only 2024's data that we're interested in, then if it is partitioned, then we can easily just retrieve 2024's data. But what they then do in addition to that is store a delta log directory. And inside that, every time the data changes, there's a commit file, which is basically just a numbered JSON file, is written into that log file directory. And that gives us all of the changes that occur over a period of time. Now, one of the tricks with that is if you're trying to work back through them, or if you're trying to, various operations you might try and do with older versions of the same data, then the problem is that could get to a point where you need to read an enormous number of those commit files to get to the thing you want. And so another option that they've added in there is the ability to have checkpoint files, where it basically is saying at this point in time, or this version, this is what the overall data looked like. And so one of the tricks with this is it allows you to deal with both versioning. So I can look at different versions of rows. I can look at time travel. So I can say, show me what this looked like back at a particular point in time. And I can also have the schema itself evolve over a period of time. So this becomes a really rich format for working with. And so, David, how do we create it?
Okay, how do you create the delta tables? And for a second there, Greg, I thought you were talking about SQL Server, but no, this is delta logs and delta tables. So look, as Greg mentioned, when you create a delta table is defined in the metastore of the lakehouse. And on top of that, the data for the tables is stored in Parquet files format in the folders, exactly like files in folders. And we're going to see that today in the demos. When you're creating the tables, there are two types of tables. So the managed tables and the external tables. In regards to the managed tables, you can imagine that those are managed by Microsoft Fabric. And the external tables, you're able to define where you want to store that information. So essentially, managed tables, they're going to be managed by Fabric, and you'll see today that they are stored under the tables folder. And the external tables, you'll be able to highlight the location where you want to store them. When it comes to data rotation, essentially, what happened with the managed tables? So when you drop the table, as it is managed by Microsoft, the table is removed from the metastore and the data is removed as well. But with external tables, the data is going to be retained even that the table has been removed from the metastore, which becomes really handy in many cases. For both the managed tables and the external tables, I think if you are working with the Microsoft Fabric ecosystem, you'll be able to take advantage of one option or the other one, depending on the use case. And to finalize, essentially, the two tables support some of the ASCII transactions that we had in traditional relational database management systems. And when it comes to performance, it is quite similar for both types of tables, but as Greg Lowe mentioned before, how you store the information when you're working with large volumes of data is important. You might decide to partition the information using a specific column or a different column. So that becomes quite relevant in the Spark world. So when you're creating the tables, the managed tables or the delta tables, you can create them from a data frame, from data, as you can see in the first option. And the main difference is actually that in the external table, you specify the location. Either way, if you're using Python or Spark SQL, whatever language you prefer, you'll be able to achieve the same outcome. But if you prefer to define the schema of the table before, you can achieve that, again, for the managed and external tables. And the main difference is that in the external tables, you'll be defining the location and where you want to store that information. But Greg, can you tell me how you actually work with those delta tables in Spark?
Yeah, so if we look at how we query this, the first thing to understand is that Spark SQL is a variant of SQL. So that's, again, a particular version of SQL that, again, was defined as part of Apache Spark. And you can embed that into a variety of languages. And so in this case here, an example in Python, where we've said, look, spark.sql, I want to insert into a products table values, and here are the values. Note how similar that looks to SQL that you might be used to from other environments. And effectively what we're doing is embedding the query as part of that. Now, the other way we could do this instead is it's very common to execute Spark SQL as part of a notebook. And if we use equivalent of a Jupyter notebook, what we do is we put a magic value in there, magic. And so the percent SQL says the code following is going to be SQL code. And then we just write literal SQL code that follows that on. And so in this case, an update statement where we're updating the products. Now, there's also a Delta API. So if you want to work directly in a language like Python with the Delta files, rather than working with the catalog tables, you could do that directly with the Delta Lake API. And so note in this one, we've said from delta.tables import, so we bring everything in from there, and from PySpark SQL functions, import asterisk, so all of those there. Then they've just defined a couple of variables. So they said, look, here's a Delta path. There's nothing magical about that. That's just actually a variable name, effectively, and they're putting filed my table. And then they've got Delta table again. And so this is effectively a variable that holds a table. And so we've said Delta table for path, and then Spark Delta, and Spark is the what we're using, and then Delta path over that saying that's where the thing is. And so what we're doing is creating a Delta table object over the top of that particular path to the data. And then the Delta table, we can say update, and then the condition is category equals this. So that's like the equivalent of a where clause, and then set price is price by whatever the value. So price ends up being assigned price by 0.9. Now, you can also use time travel. I mentioned previously that one of the powers of having this transaction log is the fact that you can look back at what a table looked like in earlier versions. And so in a notebook, as an example, if we said magic, SQL again, I say, look, describe the history for the products table. What that then returns is it shows us the modifications that occurred to that table over time. And so note the original version was version 0 at the bottom, and that's got a timestamp there, and that said, I created the table, or somebody did. And the operation was, here are the columns that were part of that definition of the table. The second version was the write that occurred. And so this is to append. And then there was an update where they've got a predicate said product ID is 1. And so note there's two things that happen. There's a timestamp that changes over time as new versions appear, but there's also a version number that lets you know what version of a particular value is there. And so what we can do with that, a couple of things. So one is, again, an example Python code. So I could say, look, I'm going to get back a data frame, effectively, but I'm saying read using the format delta. The backslash there is just a line continuation character, nothing special. And then we've said dot option, I want timestamp as of, and then I've provided the time. So I'm saying, show me what it looked like at that time and load that from the path. And that will give me based on time. But I could also say, instead, show me what it looked like at a particular version of it. So if I say version as of, that will show me the first version of this instead. And so we can use this two different ways. So we can have this, as I said, look at a particular time, or we can have this look at a particular version. Now, this is also data that's very much static data. So we've ingested the data, it's sitting inside the lakehouse, and we're just querying that directly. The other thing that we might want to work with is streaming data. And so this is a fairly common thing to want to do, particularly with things like Internet of Things readings. And so there's a thing called Spark structured streaming. And the typical thing you'd imagine, there's an input data stream, there's Spark streaming runs, deals with batches of input data, and then the Spark engine pushes that and then processes that back out. It's a bit, when you're thinking about streaming, rather than having with static data where you have data and then you sort of throw a query over at the data, the difference with streaming is it's like you have the query running all the time, but you're sort of throwing the data at the query, instead the other way around. So we're getting that to sort of process on the way through. Now, once we have this in place, we can also use this as both a streaming source. A Delta table could be used as a source for streaming data. And so the example here, they've said, again, import, in this case, Apache Spark, so SQL type, SQL functions. And we've got a data frame, again, being loaded as reader stream, format Delta, again, line continuations. So ignore changes true, but load, here's the folder that this is coming from. Keep in mind, these things tend to all be case sensitive too, just worth noting. And all they're doing at the end there is sort of showing what's in the data frame. But of course, you would do processing of it in the meantime. And you can also use this as a sink. So when you have streaming, you always have a source and you have a sink. So you could instead, again, they've got a path, an input path, just a variable, saying here's the schema. So we're going to create the schema on the fly, saying this is a structured type. And there's a field called device, which is a string. And there's a field called status, which is, again, a string. We say, let's go off and read the stream from that schema. And we've got an option saying max files per trigger, in that case, 1. And then JSON is the where it's coming from, processing. And then the input path is that variable up the top saying where are the files coming from. And if we have that as a set of values coming in, then to write that out to a Delta table, we just basically say Delta stream is, and then stream df, write stream, format Delta, option, and then a checkpoint location. Where do the checkpoint files get stored? And then .start, and then eventually we call Delta stream stop. So I won't pretend that working with streams is sort of trivial. It's one of the harder things. Most people just do tend to work with static data all the time. But it's really important to understand that it is capable of doing this. And so, look, it's time for David to just show you how it works. And I think David's muted.
Why don't we review everything in a demo? Let's set up ourselves for failure, okay? This will be a live demo. I will go through the exercise live. Before we start, actually, there's a good question in the chat. The question is, should Delta tables in a gold medallion bucket be partitioned on most queried columns, assuming cardinality is not an issue? Even if direct lake is used, partitioning is still a good idea or practice? Do you want to add a little bit to that, Greg?
Not particularly. I still think it's useful because whenever you're storing these things, if you can store it in a way that makes it easy to manipulate, then that's really, really useful anyway. So even if it is you're worried about querying against the columns, but there's other type of maintenance, all sorts of things you might want to do. And once you have it sort of petitioned, it becomes a lot easier to do that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And remember as well, because this comes from we had the same challenges in SQL Server. Right. So you don't want to partition a table with low volume of information. So you want to make sure that the partitions are big, more than 1 gigabyte.
Well, it gives you the ability. Yeah, it gives you the ability to remove a lot of things in a hurry. So if you imagine, in the case you mentioned SQL Server, if you have a bank or something and you need to remove every month, you need to remove a month's worth of transactions. I can assure you a delete statement is not the way to do that. So you want to be able to just switch out a petition and just basically remove that entire month's data as a metadata operation, not as something where you're going off deleting one row at a time or, things like that. That doesn't make sense. And so it's exactly the same sort of deal here, is that if we have a whole folder structure that's based around dates and things, becomes an awful lot easier to do things like let's remove a month's worth of data, or let's remove older data and things like that. Becomes very easy, and that's unrelated to the advantages that you get via querying.
Yeah, Thank you, Greg. I think let's let's go to the exercise now. So if you join the module, we're going to go directly to the exercise of using data tables in Apache Spark. And now we're going to click on launch the exercise. I'm going to move, essentially, this is a step-by-step exercise. I'm going to move this to a different screen and we'll get started. So let's open this link. Let's go and follow this one. So essentially, we're going to mention this, reinforce this message later, but remember that you can start a trial with Microsoft Fabric for 60 days. And for this exercise, we're going to be using the Synapse data engineering experience. So we put our Synapse data engineering hat and we go for the exercise. The first step will be for us to create a workspace. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new workspace. Data tables. I keep the name quite original.
What do you think of workspaces as? What do you tend to create them for?
Well, that's a good question. Essentially, I've seen it all the different flavors. So I've seen companies that they prefer to split it by business units, and I think that's a good idea. It's definitely not. It's not going to cover 100% of the scenarios, but at least it's a good idea to isolate different domain knowledges within the company. So that's the recommendation. Start by splitting it based on business unit for medium and large organizations. The small ones, I guess, they have more flexibility. Then you also have all the other cases where an individual from a specific department needs to access the information from marketing or sales and operations and so on. So there is not silver bullet that I found personally. What about you, Greg?
Yeah, pretty much the same. We tend to separate out workspaces for areas that people are building things, but also where people are accessing things. So for both reasons, actually. So where there's a whole lot of people that need to access similar stuff, we often use workspaces for that. But it's very, very common to have like a number of people working on projects and have them isolated by workspaces as well.
Yeah, that's great. So let's be the data engineering team. That's a good idea. And as you scroll down to enable the Fabric capabilities, make sure that you have the trial option enabled. So then we can hit apply, and this is going to take us to a blank workspace. Here is where we can create all our objects. The first step for this exercise will be to create actually a lakehouse and upload some data. So I'm going to come here, and I'm going to create a lakehouse, and we'll call it data tables. And this is going to take us to a new experience. So in this experience, the first step that we're going to follow actually is to upload some data. So if you follow the link in the lab, in the exercise, essentially it's going to take you to this data set. Good way to do it, you just right click, save as, and this will allow you to download a file into a specific folder. So now we have our sample data set for the exercise, and we're going to proceed to create a subfolder in our lakehouse. And we're going to name this subfolder products, keep it original. And now we have, from the context menu, we can just click upload files. We find our products CSV file. Greg?
Yeah, and I was going to say, and importantly, this is happening in the files folder, not the tables folder.
Yeah, that's right. So we're doing everything right now in the files folder. We're just uploading some information. You in a real scenario, you'll automate this process to pick up the file every night or every 2 hours or every 2 weeks and drop that file into that specific repository.
And typically that would happen with pipelines, and there is an upcoming session on pipelines.
So let's go and refresh this folder here. Click products, and you'll see my products CSV file. So if you are following along with the exercise, now we're going to explore this file into a data frame. So what we want to do essentially is click this file, open notebook, and we're going to click new notebook. And we're going to visualize that file using Apache Spark. I like to, upfront, I usually forget, but I like to put the name of the notebook as soon as I create it. Especially with the autosave.
Maybe worth also of interest too, just showing with that PySpark Python dropdown, just that the notebooks have lots of different environments we could be doing this in. So this is just, we happen to have chosen PySpark as what we want to do using the Python language.
Yeah, I think it's spot on, right? So if you, my strong language will be a Spark SQL. So I tend to do everything in Spark SQL. So if you like Python, go with it. But you can also use Scala, and I think there are also APIs that you can use to create this automatically, if that's what you're looking for. We're going to copy some code from the exercise. I'm not going to type it because that will be setting up myself for failure. Okay. So we'll put this in here, and we're going to run, essentially, this is coming from files, the product we just created, and we're going to execute this. At this stage, we're just working a little bit with the lakehouse, writing some Python, but we haven't still created any delta tables. And that'll be essentially the next step. The first time that you create a lakehouse and you run the query, it takes some more time because it has to spin up the instance for running this specific workload. And now you can visualize as well the content of the file. So this has been only setting up a little bit of infrastructure, the environment for our exercises. Now we're going to go ahead. And as you can see in tables, I don't have anything. I just have one file in products. So what we're going to do next is to create the delta tables. We're going to start reviewing some of the scenarios that Greg Lowe and myself mentioned before. So the first step will be if we want to create a managed table. So remember, managed table will be controlled by Microsoft Fabric, and it will display under the tables section. So we saved before, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but we saved before the information in the file into a data frame. And now we're going to create a table from the data. So we're going to save that data frame information as a delta format in this specific table. So we'll run this code.
While it's running, it's worth noting too that the language is an attribute of the cell that you're running too. Note that's in the bottom right there. And so one thing that throws people sometimes is that you can have notebooks with different cells with different languages as part of the same thing.
Yeah, that's a great point actually. And if you want to change the language for a specific cell, you can either type the wildcard and the language, or just change it at the cell level.
Where the language up the top is more sort of like the default language that's going to be used for the cell. And the other thing you may have noticed that when David was going plus to add the code, the thing beside it also was Markdown, right? And so one of the beautiful things about notebooks is that you can write quite detailed documentation in the notebook itself in a rich text format using Markdown. And that stays as part of that. That's so much cleaner than, for example, a SQL script where it's very hard to you can't put like high quality documentation in that. Mind you, there are SQL notebooks nowadays, but that's one of the benefits of notebooks.
Yeah, it's great that you point that out, Greg, because I've seen what we want to see basically when you open a notebook is for that notebook to make sense to you, even if it's the first time that you're reading. So you really want to spend time explaining the step, making that sustainable for your colleagues and new professionals. And now, after creating the managed table, so we're going to refresh the tables in here. You'll see that we have our table in there. So now we can load this into Spark. You can query this using shortcuts from a data warehouse and so on. But this is just a managed table. Let's go ahead and create a new external table. That's what I want to do. So when you're creating an external table, you're going to specify the location. That's the main difference. So we're still using the data frame, saving that with this specific table, but look how we're adding an option in here. So we're saying, okay, we're going to save this information in this specific path. So when you're following this step, you really want to copy the AVFS path, put it towards here. And now we go ahead and execute the step. Remember to change that specific information in the code. So we created the managed table. Now we're creating the external table. We're going to start looking at some of the differences between them. So we're going to refresh this step. And now we have the external and the managed products table. So let's go and describe the two tables. So we see a little bit the difference. This is what Greg Lowe mentioned before. So now I want to write some SQL. So I'm going to change the language by using this wildcard. And I could also, just by doing this option, it will add it automatically. So describe this one. And we're going to describe as well the external table. And then we're going to compare. Let me put this one.
And so that gives you a formatted details of the structure of the table. One of the other things that we mentioned you could do before is you could actually say describe history for the table, and that was one of the things that would give you the versions of it as well.
Oh, the different, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at this one. You'll see the main difference when we look at this is the managed table, and when I make this a little bit wider, you'll see that this table is managed by Microsoft Fabric in the one lake. On the other hand, if I scroll down to our external table and we extend this description in here, we'll see towards the end. We have to navigate towards the end with the two of them. This one. So you can see this is managed by Microsoft Fabric under the tables folder, and this one is managed. It's managed by us under the files, external products folder. So that means that if I would refresh this section here, we also have the information of our external products table being stored into the file section. And when we click that specific folder, you can see the information, the data for the file, as well as all the logs. And we're going to do a little bit of we're going to explore table versioning, but before we do that, let's go and check what happens when we delete, when we go and we drop those folders, drop those tables, sorry. So let's go and drop the two tables. This is a key takeaway from this step in the exercise. So we drop the two tables. So this is going to delete from the table folder, the external products and the managed products table. So when I refresh, those tables are not there. My managed products information is gone, so we don't have access to that information anymore. But in the case of the external table, you can see that the information is still here as well, which is a big difference. So when you are working with external tables, remember that you have control on how the information is maintained, stored, and if you have to delete it, you have to factor in one extra step. So that means that if the information didn't go anywhere, essentially we can recreate the table by pointing to that specific area. So we're going to recreate our table because the information was never deleted, and that table will appear one more time in here.
And note also the little triangle on the products table when that's created. So that the little triangle in the icon there beside the word products, that is the thing that indicates this is a delta table too. So the triangle, yeah, being the Greek delta symbol.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. Good. Okay, we're halfway already the exercise. So you've seen some of the differences between managed and external tables. Let's go and look at some of the most amazing capabilities within data. And it's table versioning. As Greg Lowe was mentioning before, you can go and check, update the table, and a new version will be created for the tables. So let's go and update our products table to reduce the list price of the mountain bike. So get this.
Very familiar data if you've ever worked with AdventureWorks in the past too. There's always mountain bikes. Yeah, so.
I think all of us were experts in AdventureWorks, and
yeah.
If that company was real, it'll be doing quite well from a data analytics point of view. So we just updated 32 rows, and we're going to write the code that Greg mentioned before. So we're going to describe the history of the products table, and we'll see the different versions as well. So you can see version O. So when we created a table, I can scroll down all the way to the right, and you'll see we have one file, and we created 295 rows. And the last version, which was you can see here, it was an update. So this new version is an update. So if I scroll down to the right, you see that we have updated 32 rows. This information, I think, is quite handy from a logs point of view, from audit point of view, as well from performance improvement point of view. But what if we want to compare the two versions? So essentially, by using the code, we're going to put that now here. So if we load that information, each version, we're going to load the current data into a data frame, and we're going to load the previous version into a data frame as well. So let's run this step. So that it's going to allow you essentially to start comparing versions and identifying patterns as well. And if you've been working with slowly changing dimensions, type 2 or so on, this will look quite familiar for you to take into account.
Important to note too that when you looked at that history, that the entries are for the table. There's a commit in there, not per row. So so we didn't end up with hundreds of entries in there for each row in that history list.
In this one here, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's good to know that. And as well, if we click back let's compare this. Okay, so we're showing this is the new version. Let's look at this specific item 771. It's a mountain bike that is being on sale now for $3,059, while in our previous version, it was being sold for almost $3,400. So that's versioning. It works for delete, inserts, updates, and so on. And you'll see as well if I go to our external products folder and we'll refresh this. We have a new version of our table. It's being stored in here, and also the logs, they have increased because we have performed some operations. So
important too, they're very readable files too. There's nothing tricky about these, unlike where we have, data formats that are very proprietary and things like that. The format of these things is very straightforward.
So you have all the information, essentially how much information we updated and so on. You can see it in here as well. which is, we should have, somebody should build a Power BI report that exposes this information, right?
Yeah. I think, look, one of the things that I think is really important about these open formats, though, is that it gives you the opportunity to add, lots of your own utilities or different ways of dealing with this, or third parties to build utilities. It's a real beauty having it in that sort of open format.
All right. So far we checked how to create the manage and external tables. Had a quick look at versioning with the tables. This is not rocket science. We could go and delete all the information from here, and essentially we'll create a new version of that specific table. Then, if this happens, I don't know if any of you have deleted things from production, and you had to restore a backup to go back to the correct version. But well, this is maybe not the definitive answer for restoring the information. Versioning allows you to go and restore a previous version if that's what you're looking for.
Deals with the oops moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Oops. I forgot to add the word clause, right? And this is where yeah, you have to go through that exercise at least once in your lifetime. Okay, let's go to the last section of our exercise, that is working with streaming data. For the streaming data section, so let's go and add a specific title. So we know that we're starting a new section, and we're going to essentially use delta tables as the destination for some streaming information. So for creating that streaming test scenario, we're going to essentially create the following structure. We're going to create a Spark read stream object. So we're going to read information from there, and we're going to add some information into it. So let's go and create our test data. And the next step, so this will be our source information. So we're going to read this stream data, but the next step will be for us to create where the information is going to go. And in that case, again, so we're going to create a delta table for storing that information. So when you see above, so you can see we're defining where the information is going to come from for the streaming object, adding some information into it, and then we're telling it that we're going to write that streaming data into a delta table. Nothing changes here, so the main difference is the type of object that we use, that is IoT stream. So now we are going to go ahead and refresh our objects, our tables, and our products. We're going to query this new table. So this is basically reading from that streaming data set and putting that information into a delta table. But look what happened when we add more information in our IoT test data. So the idea is, in traditional scenario, what happens? So once the new information is published, then you run a pipeline, and then you move that information to a destination system. With the streaming data, we're actively looking for new rows in our streaming source. So once that we add information to the original streaming data, so we're going to load some more information in that IoT device. So see how this information is still stored under our data folder. So that's where we put that information. So but now if we query again our IoT device data, you will see that the new rows, they have been added. think this is great. It removes, if you are working with those scenarios of utilities or you're streaming data from IoT devices, this simplifies a lot the data movement. We haven't had to go again, we haven't had to trigger a pipeline. This was actively looking for new rows. So that one makes a big difference in the scenario for streaming. It does simplify a lot what we used to do before.
David, can you also show the history for that table so we can see how that ended up in there?
Yeah. So let's go on. You will think that I'm going to write any code, right? That's not going to happen. And we're going to add some code at the end. We should have collapsed those steps. Code. And we're going to describe the history for IoT. Wish to know.
Singular, yeah.
All right, so we have the same scenario. So we have the first version, two versions of the table. The operation, you can see now that it says streaming update. That's it. And if we keep going to the section, I think this is important. This is an append operation. So it's adding to it. But to the right, we're going to expand the just essentially here. And you'll see that the main difference is, so the first time we streamed 9 rows, and the second time we streamed 7 rows in here.
Wonderful.
And I think that's great. I like this a lot. All of us, a lot of us, let's put it this way, we knew about dynamic builds in SQL Server and so on, so we can find the familiarity, I guess, when reading this information, right? And this as well, by somebody asked before about partitioning, right? So having access to this information will allow you to start thinking of performance tuning and so on. And if you made it this far in the exercise, I must say I'm proud of you. I had to go through this exercise 3 or 4 times before being able to show it to you. Really easy to get across the different steps, but that's all. So that was the exercise. This is almost the end of the module. To clean up the resources, once that you got to this point, I don't know if there are any questions that we have to cover, but doesn't seem to be. So final step, we want to keep everything tidy. So once that you finish the exercise, you can click back in the workspace and to delete the items, go to workspace settings, other, and remove this workspace. So I don't need this information anymore. So we go and delete it, and some other information about an event. But that's all. Great. So that was the exercise. So maybe I'm going to hand it over back to you.
Indeed. So the next thing we just do a quick check is just a knowledge check based on the items that we've just sort of talked our way through. And so look, with each of these, there's a link appearing on your screen that has polls, and this allows you to sort of vote for what you think is the right answer in each case. And so if we look at the first one here, so which of the following descriptions best fits Delta Lake? And so is it a Spark API? Let me
scan the QR code. Let me go and I'll do it myself, Greg. I think I have this one.
Go off and grab the QR code and vote away. Yeah.
So
is it a Spark API for exporting data from a relational database to CSV files? Or is it B, a relational storage layer for Spark that supports tables that are based on Parquet files? Or is it C, a synchronization solution that replicates data between SQL Server and Spark? So we'll just give everybody a few moments to do the voting.
Can I answer this one, Greg? Can I answer this one? I think I have
it. Yes. I think you'll know the answer to that one, indeed. Now, with the polls, we've got the polls live at the moment. And so, David, are you able to see what the polls are showing?
Yes, yeah, I see it. And I put my answer through as well. So look, I think most people got a good idea about this. We already have 36 votes in a specific one.
Or B. Yeah.
37 is going up. 38, the percentage of success, our success, right? So if you people get it right, it seems that we did a good job.
That's good. So question 2 says you've loaded a Spark data frame with data that you now want in a Delta table. So which format should you use to write the data frame to storage? That's a little trickier. So again, vote away.
It is. We already have some votes coming in. See, 10 votes, 15. The number is going up. A lot of people, a lot of you trying to learn about Delta tables. That's great.
So, of course, the subtle difference, between these, and so the formats there. And, of course, the answer to that, it looks like most of the votes are there for C, and, of course, that is the one. So Parquet, we said, was good for storing data in a sort of compressed format and storing columns separately and so on. Delta is the thing that adds the transaction log details and so on over the top of it and gives us those transactional capabilities. And so question 3, then you have a managed table based on a folder that has data files in Delta format. And if you then drop the table, so this is a managed table, what happens to the underlying files? And so A, the table metadata and the data files are deleted, or B, the table definition is removed out of the data store, but the data files stay intact, or C, the table definition stays in the meta store, but the data files are deleted. So again, take a look and vote.
I think I know this one as well, Greg. I might score 3 out of 3, you know?
Interestingly, there's a little bit of a spread of the votes, but the vast majority are voting for A, which is, of course, the correct answer in this case. And so, look, to summarize, David, what have we learned?
I think we covered a lot of ground, definitely, very low, but let's put it this way. So 4 things that we wanted to cover is for you to understand a little bit more about Delta Lake and Delta tables within Microsoft Fabric, how to use them, taking advantage of Spark. Of course, use Spark to query the information in those Delta tables structure, looking at versioning as well as at the streaming. If you have any questions in regards to this topic, remember, so you can still access this module by accessing the information in the website. But I think do have so that will be the next slide. I think can we share the link again to access the work with Delta Lake tables in Microsoft?
We can. So this link here actually gives you the Delta Lake documentation. And so, look, one of the things that you should consider too, because these are open formats, as well as the documentation that comes from Microsoft, whenever you have an open format like this, there's a lot you can learn by going back to the standards documents.
Yeah.
And so suggest this is quite good, though, the Delta Lake documentation that's in place, but very much suggest that you also have a look at details just on Parquet as a format and the Delta Lake formats as well. Listen, while we're going through the next few things that we want to mention, I'd encourage you, if you have any other questions, now would be a good time to pop them in, and we'll sort of take those at the end if best we can. One's already come in, though, which is asking, what's your thoughts on performance differences between managed tables and external tables?
So as far as I know, for the documentation, the underlying structure and how it is stored from a performance point of view is all the same.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, it's going to depend on the storage and connectivity and things like that across to those objects. But yeah, there's nothing fundamentally different about how they're dealt with in that regard. And so look, there's, we mentioned previously these links that David was talking about, where you can go and have a look at this detail, do the exercises, watch the videos, do the practice. Look, I'd encourage you to do that. Even though it's really useful to watch somebody else take you through it, it's completely different for you to go through and do it yourself. You know, it's because whenever you find, there's two things I like about doing it myself. One is that you might make mistakes, and I often find I learn more when I make a mistake trying to work out what I should have done and go off exploring different areas, you know, inside the thing I was trying to do. And so that's actually really, really good. And it also just encourages you to look at other things around in the area that you're working in. So I think that's really important. This is not, as I said, though, the end of this. The next one in this series is actually one on Data Factory pipelines. And so we've had Azure Data Factory, where we had pipelines in place for many years now. It's actually quite a mature product that we use all the time. In Synapse Analytics, we had pipelines in Synapse as well. And this is another evolution of these, where we have Data Factory pipelines now living inside Fabric. Have you started to work with these at all, David?
I have started to work with Data Factory pipelines in Fabric. The experience has been quite good, actually. I do spend a lot of time with Azure Data Factory and Synapse pipelines, and then this is, I guess, my third iteration of a different flavor that I have from the pipelines. And a lot of new things. Yeah.
Look, I find most projects that we do, we probably spend at least 70 or 80% of the time on transforming the data and getting it into the right shape and cleansing it and doing all those sorts of things. And so Data Factory is likely to be a place you could end up spending quite a bit of time when you're working with Fabric. And so I'd strongly encourage you to have a look at that. In terms of the timing that's shown on the screen there, I know it's got an India time, but that's exactly the same time as this session was. So if you're in another area, not in India, just keep in mind that the timing for that is exactly the same as the timing for this. And of course, again, the Data Factory pipelines is just the next one. We then mentioned before that there's a whole lot more coming beyond that. Look, another question that's come in is, what's the difference between an external table and a shortcut?
That's a good question. And definitely, I don't know if the shortcut moved the information, to be totally honest. I believe the shortcut is just a pointer to information that is already been stored in that specific folder.
Yeah, the idea with shortcuts is that you don't want to be necessarily moving the data around. And so maybe you have data in a data lake somewhere else, for example, and you want to make use of it inside your project, but you end up just basically putting pointers across to that. Keep in mind that there are additional jumps across to doing that, where an external table isn't necessarily like that at all. Mind you, there's also nothing to stop you creating shortcuts that point back into your own files and things too. You know, there are things you could do with that. But most of the time, shortcuts are set up to get you off to potentially like another data lake or something like that. There's one question came into, are the data tables HIPAA approved? And that's an interesting one there. I would have thought that the tables are just actually the data table formats. I would have thought for HIPAA compliance, it'd be more about the governance over the top of that and how you've stored the data inside those files would have been the biggest issues. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, David.
No, I don't have any thoughts or recommendations on that. I'm not fully across that compliance certification right now.
Yep. No, good. And so look, we mentioned before, we encourage you to get started with the Fabric Cloud Skills Challenge. And so, as I said, it's also just one of a number of cloud skills challenges. Don't limit yourself just to the Fabric one, but we'd like to see you do that one first. But if you have a look at the ones that are up there, there are a lot of challenges there that give you sort of a guided path to go off and sort of learn a whole lot of topics. And that's sort of really, really sort of useful for you to do in that case. And so what about upgrades though, David?
I think you're still allowed, if you're starting with Fabric or you want to run a proof of concept within your organization or something really small, remember that you can upgrade to use the trial free version of Fabric for 60 days. And I think that's a great starting point. I highly recommend everybody go and have a play with it, go and convince your team leader, your manager to run a proof of concept on it. So you can have a taste of the capabilities on Microsoft Fabric, which it is the flagship for data analytics solutions within Microsoft ecosystem. So it's not going anywhere, and we'll see a lot of capabilities being released in the platform in the upcoming years.
Excellent. Well, listen, that's where we'll wrap it up today. So thank you, David, for your participation, and thank you everybody else for being involved.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, moderator. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Yeah.